The twilight of autumn painted the Iberian Peninsula in shades of gold and crimson as King Roderick rode toward his final battle. Behind him stretched a kingdom already fracturing at its foundations. The Visigothic realm that had ruled these lands for 3 centuries now trembled on the edge of collapse. Noble houses plotted against one another, while peasants struggled beneath crushing taxation. The royal court seethed with intrigue, succession disputes poisoning the very air of Toledo's halls. Few could have imagined that within a single year, this ancient realm would vanish entirely, swept away by forces gathering strength across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar. The call to conquest had originated not in the palaces of Damascus, but in the ambitions of men who saw opportunity in chaos. Musa ibn Nusayr, the Umayyad governor of North Africa, had spent years consolidating Arab and Berber tribes under his command. His lieutenant, Tariq ibn Ziyad, commanded fierce Berber warriors who had learned the arts of war in the Atlas Mountains and Saharan borderlands. These men looked across the Mediterranean's narrowest passage, a mere 8 miles of water, and saw a land ripe for the taking. The invitation came from an unexpected source. Count Julian, master of Ceuta and guardian of the Straits, nursed grievances against King Roderick that burned deeper than political ambition. Whether driven by personal vendetta or calculated opportunism, Julian opened secret negotiations with the Arab commanders. His intimate knowledge of Gothic weaknesses, combined with his control of the crossing points, transformed what might have been a risky expedition into a carefully orchestrated invasion. Spring brought more than wildflowers to the Iberian coast. Tariq's advance force landed near the great rock that would forever bear his name, Jabal Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq. The small contingent of Berber warriors who first set foot on European soil gazed upon rolling hills dotted with olive groves and vineyards, their eyes scanning terrain that promised both challenge and reward. Behind them, the North African coast shimmered in the morning light. Ahead lay an entire peninsula waiting to be conquered. The initial landings met minimal resistance. Coastal garrisons, undermanned and poorly supplied, offered only token opposition before retreating inland. Word of the invasion spread like wildfire through the Gothic territories, but the response revealed the kingdom's fatal weakness. Local commanders waited for royal orders that came too slowly. Regional nobles calculated whether this foreign threat might serve their own ambitions. The machinery of defense, corroded by decades of internal strife, creaked and stalled when swift action was most desperately needed. Encouraged by these early successes, Musa dispatched reinforcements across the strait. Thousands of Arab cavalry and Berber infantry swelled Tariq's ranks, transforming his expedition into a true army of conquest. The newcomers brought with them not only weapons and horses, but also administrators, judges, and scholars, men prepared to govern as well as to fight. This was no mere raid for plunder. It was the beginning of a new chapter in Iberian history. The decisive moment came near the banks of the Guadalete River, where the old world met the new in a clash that would echo through centuries. King Roderick finally assembled his forces, a polyglot army of Gothic nobles, Hispano-Roman infantry, and conscripted peasants. On paper, his numbers seemed formidable, but the reality betrayed deeper problems. Mistrust plagued the ranks as different factions eyed one another with suspicion. Some nobles had already decided that perhaps a change of masters might serve their interests better than loyalty to a weakened crown. The battle itself unfolded with devastating swiftness. Tariq's cavalry, seasoned by years of desert warfare, exploited gaps in the Gothic lines with precision and ferocity. When key nobles abandoned the field, whether through cowardice or treachery, the royal army disintegrated, King Roderick disappeared into the chaos of defeat, his body never found, his crown lost somewhere in the muddy waters of the Guadalete. With him died not just a king, but an entire dynasty's claim to rule. Victory opened the peninsula like a flower before the dawn. Córdoba surrendered after a brief siege, its Roman walls and Gothic palaces passing into Arab hands with barely a struggle. Seville followed suit, its wealthy merchants preferring negotiation to destruction. Toledo, the ancient royal capital, held out longer. But even this great stronghold eventually opened its gates rather than face the fate of cities that had chosen resistance over submission. The speed of conquest astonished even its architects. Within 7 years, Arab armies had swept from the southern beaches to the Pyrenean peaks, establishing the province of Al-Andalus under Umayyad authority. Only in the far northern mountains did pockets of faithful resistance maintain their independence, clinging to rocky refuges where pursuit was difficult and reward seemed meager. This rapid transformation reflected more than military superiority. The Arab conquerors arrived with a sophisticated understanding of governance that had been refined through decades of expansion across North Africa and the Middle East. They offered terms that many found preferable to Gothic rule. Followers of Christ and adherents of Judaism could maintain their faiths and properties in exchange for tribute. Local customs would be respected, and competent administrators, regardless of their origins, could find places in the new order. The arrival of Abd al-Rahman I in Al-Andalus marked the beginning of a new era. This Umayyad prince had fled Damascus when the Abbasids seized the Caliphate, massacring his family and ending Umayyad rule in the east. His dramatic escape across North Africa and subsequent establishment of an independent emirate in Córdoba brought legitimacy and ambition to the Arab presence in Iberia. No longer merely a distant province, Al-Andalus began developing its own identity and aspirations. Under Umayyad rule, the conquered territories experienced a cultural renaissance that would astound contemporaries and influence centuries of development. Córdoba grew into one of Europe's largest cities, its population swelling with immigrants from across the Islamic world. Scholars arrived carrying manuscripts of Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, and Arab science. Artisans brought techniques for working silk, producing paper, and crafting intricate geometric decorations. Engineers designed irrigation systems that transformed arid valleys into gardens of extraordinary fertility. The local population faced a complex array of choices under their new rulers. Many converted to Islam, drawn by the opportunities that came with belonging to the dominant faith. Others maintained their beliefs while adopting Arab customs and language, becoming known as Mozarabs. Jewish communities, long persecuted under Gothic law, found themselves welcomed as valuable contributors to commerce and administration. This mixing of peoples and traditions created a unique society that borrowed elements from all its constituent parts. Yet even in the first flush of conquest, seeds of future conflict were being sown. In the remote valleys of Asturias, a Gothic nobleman named Pelayo gathered followers around a simple but powerful idea. The Arab conquest was not permanent, and the old faith could be restored through divine providence, courage, and persistence. His small band of refugees, sheltering in mountain caves and forgotten fortresses, represented something new in Iberian history, the birth of a movement that would define the next 8 centuries. The victory at Covadonga, though little more than a successful ambush in a mountain pass, resonated far beyond its military significance. For the first time since Roderick's defeat, forces of the old faith had faced Arab troops and emerged victorious. The triumph was modest, perhaps a few hundred casualties on either side, but its symbolic impact proved enormous. Word spread through the northern mountains that resistance was possible, that the seemingly invincible conquerors could be defeated. From this humble beginning, the concept that would later be called the Reconquista began to take shape. It started not as a grand strategy, but as a desperate struggle for survival in harsh mountain terrain, where agriculture was difficult and life was precarious. The survivors faced challenges that would test every aspect of their faith and resolve: how to maintain their religious traditions without bishops or monasteries, how to preserve royal legitimacy without a kingdom, how to sustain military resistance without adequate resources. The geography of northern Iberia itself became an ally in this struggle. The Cantabrian Mountains, rising like a natural fortress along the Atlantic coast, offered countless valleys where small communities could maintain independence while remaining hidden from larger armies. The Arab commanders, initially confident that these holdouts would eventually submit or starve, gradually discovered that mountain warfare required different tactics and commitments than their successful campaigns across the open plains of central and southern Iberia. As the first century of Arab rule progressed, both sides began to understand that they faced not a temporary crisis, but a permanent transformation of Iberian society. The conquerors realized that complete pacification of the peninsula would require more time, resources, and attention than originally anticipated. The faithful resistors understood that their survival depended not on a single great victory, but on building sustainable communities that could endure through generations of struggle. The stage was set for a conflict unlike any other in medieval Europe, a prolonged confrontation between two faiths, two cultures, and two visions of Iberia's future. In the palaces of Córdoba, poets would soon sing of Al-Andalus as a paradise on earth, a land where knowledge flourished and tolerance reigned. In the cold halls of Asturian fortresses, chroniclers would record the deeds of kings who never ceased to dream of Toledo's restoration. Between these two worlds, in the shifting frontier lands where the two territories met, a complex society would emerge that belonged fully to neither tradition, yet drew strength from both. The Crescent had risen over Iberia, but it would not shine unchallenged. In the mountain refuges of the north, a different light was already beginning to kindle. The flame of Reconquest that would burn for 8 centuries and ultimately transform not just Spain, but the entire world. The fall of Damascus to Abbasid forces sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world, but nowhere were the consequences more immediately felt than in distant Al-Andalus. When news arrived that the Umayyad caliphs had been massacred and their dynasty extinguished in the east, the Iberian Emirate faced a crisis of legitimacy that would paradoxically strengthen both conqueror and conquered. Abd al-Rahman. I had already declared independence from Eastern authority, but the collapse of his ancestral dynasty forced him to reimagine Al-Andalus as something entirely new, not merely a province of a distant empire, but a sovereign realm with its own destiny. This transformation would have profound consequences for the mountain strongholds of the north, as their Umayyad neighbors evolved from provincial governors into independent rulers with imperial ambitions. In the mist-shrouded valleys of Asturias, Pelayo's successors faced the monumental task of transforming a desperate band of refugees into a functioning state. His son, Favila, ruled briefly before meeting his end in a bear hunt, a reminder that survival in these harsh mountains required vigilance against more than human enemies. It was Favila's brother-in-law, Alfonso I, who would lay the true foundations of what history would remember as the first great revival of Gothic power. Alfonso I, known to posterity as the Catholic, possessed the vision and ruthlessness necessary for state building in an age of constant warfare. He understood that survival required more than successful ambushes. It demanded the creation of institutions that could outlast individual rulers. Under his leadership, the tiny realm of Asturias began its transformation from refugee camp to royal court, establishing the legal, administrative, and religious structures that would define Iberian monarchy for centuries to come. The Asturian strategy was born of necessity, but proved remarkably effective. Unable to match the wealth and sophistication of Córdoba, the mountain chieftains developed a different model of opposition based on mobility, local knowledge, and what would later be called guerrilla warfare. They avoided pitched battles when possible, striking instead at isolated garrisons, supply convoys, and administrative centers, before melting back into the familiar terrain of their highland strongholds. This tactical innovation, born from desperation, would become a defining characteristic of Iberian warfare. Alfonso's greatest innovation was not tactical but demographic. Recognizing that empty land could not be defended, he initiated a policy of repopulation, moving loyal subjects into abandoned territories, founding new settlements, and establishing monasteries that served as both spiritual centers and fortified outposts. These communities became the backbone of expansion, creating a buffer zone of loyal populations between the Asturian heartland and Arab territories to the south. The policy of pressura, claiming and settling abandoned lands, would become a cornerstone of the Reconquest movement. The establishment of Santiago de Compostela during this period provided the mountain realms with something they desperately needed: a spiritual identity that could compete with the sophisticated theology of Islam. The discovery of what believers claimed were the remains of the Apostle James created a pilgrimage destination that would attract visitors from throughout Europe, bringing not only religious prestige, but also economic benefits and international connections that transformed the isolated mountain realm into a player on the continental stage. The legend surrounding Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moorslayer, took shape during these crucial decades. Stories spread of the apostle appearing on a white horse during battles, leading the faithful to victory against overwhelming odds. Whether these accounts reflected divine intervention or clever propaganda mattered less than their effect on morale. Soldiers who believed they fought alongside a heavenly champion displayed courage that often proved decisive in crucial engagements. The Camino de Santiago, the pilgrimage route that wound through the territories under royal control, became more than a spiritual journey. It was a lifeline that connected the revolt to the broader world of Latin Christianity. French knights, Italian merchants, and German pilgrims carried news, resources, and support that sustained the mountain cause. Monasteries along the route became centers of learning, where Mozarabic refugees from the south preserved texts and traditions that might otherwise have been lost. These monastic communities developed their own unique character, blending Benedictine traditions with the practical demands of frontier life. The monastery of San Juan de la Peña in Aragon, carved directly into a cliff face and virtually invisible from below, exemplified this synthesis of spiritual purpose and defensive necessity. Its monks copied manuscripts, tended crops, and maintained watch for enemy raiders with equal dedication. As the 8th century gave way to the 9th, new powers emerged in the Pyrenean foothills. The realm of Navarre, centered on the fortress city of Pamplona, carved out its own sphere of influence by playing different sides against one another. Its rulers, neither fully aligned with the revolt nor completely subjected to Córdoba, demonstrated that survival might require pragmatism as much as ideology. Navarrese diplomacy became legendary for its complexity, as successive kings navigated between Frankish, Asturian, and Umayyad pressures. Meanwhile, in the eastern valleys, Charlemagne's failed expedition to Zaragoza had inadvertently created another centre of opposition. The rearguard action at Roncevaux, where Roland fell defending the Frankish retreat, became legendary not just in French epic poetry, but in the local folklore of communities that saw in the Frankish defeat an opportunity for independence. From this chaos emerged the county of Aragon, small but strategically positioned to control vital mountain passes between France and the Iberian heartland. The fragmentation of highland opposition into multiple political entities, Asturias, Leon, Navarre, Aragon, might have seemed like weakness, but it proved surprisingly resilient. Each territory developed its own character, legal traditions, and tactical approaches, while maintaining loose cooperation against their common enemy. When one fell under pressure, others could provide refuge and support. When opportunities arose, they could coordinate their efforts to maximum effect. Leon emerged as the dominant power during the reign of Alfonso III, who expanded the realm's borders southward into the Duero Valley and established a new capital that could better support royal administration. The move from the mountain fastness of Oviedo to the plains city of Leon symbolized the transformation of the revolt from desperate survival to confident expansion. No longer content merely to defend their refuges, the highland rulers began to dream of reconquest. This period witnessed the development of a unique warrior culture that would define Iberian society for centuries. Unlike the feudal systems emerging elsewhere in Europe, where combat service was tied to land tenure, these frontier territories developed a more egalitarian tradition where fighting ability and loyalty to the crown could earn advancement regardless of birth. This meritocratic element would become a defining characteristic of Iberian society, producing generations of knights and adventurers who saw warfare as a path to wealth and status. The legal codes developed during this period reflected the unique circumstances of frontier society. The fuero juzgo, based on earlier Gothic law but adapted for new realities, established principles that would influence Iberian jurisprudence for centuries. These codes recognized the rights of different communities, nobles, clergy, townspeople, and even former captives, while establishing clear hierarchies and obligations for defensive service. The concept of hidalguía, noble status earned through service rather than inherited through blood, began to take shape in these mountain communities. Monastic communities played a crucial role in this cultural development, but their function extended far beyond spiritual guidance. Benedictine monasteries became centers of learning, agriculture, and craft production, while also serving tactical functions, providing intelligence about enemy movements, sheltering refugees, and sometimes actively participating in combat. The monastery of San Millán de la Cogolla became particularly significant as a center where monks preserved not only religious texts, but also the earliest written examples of Romance languages emerging from Latin throughout the former Roman territories. The glosas emilianenses, marginal notes written in vernacular tongues found in manuscripts at San Millán, represent some of the earliest evidence of Spanish and Basque as distinct languages. These documents demonstrate that the mountain realms were not merely preserving the past, but creating something new, a distinctively Iberian form of Christianity that would eventually challenge the Islamic South for control of the peninsula. The development of vernacular literature would prove as important as tactical innovation in creating a sense of shared identity among diverse mountain communities. As Al-Andalus reached its cultural zenith under Abd al-Rahman III, who proclaimed himself Caliph in 929, the highland territories faced their greatest challenge yet: The Cordoba Caliphate commanded resources that dwarfed anything the mountain rulers could marshal. A population in the millions compared to their thousands, vast agricultural wealth, international trade networks, and the most sophisticated administration in Western Europe. The Caliph's palace city of Medina Azahara, with its elaborate gardens, intricate mosaics, and imported marble columns, symbolized a level of luxury and refinement that made the stone halls of Leon and Oviedo seem primitive by comparison. Yet the mountain territories possessed advantages that statistics could not measure. They had intimate knowledge of terrain that remained mysterious to southern armies. They enjoyed the support of populations that had chosen opposition over accommodation. Most importantly, they had developed a sense of mission that transformed individual campaigns into religious crusades, giving soldiers reasons to fight that transcended immediate material concerns. The cult of Santiago provided a unifying symbol that transcended local loyalties and regional rivalries. The constant warfare of this period produced innovations in architecture and tactics that would influence European combat for generations. Highland rulers developed new forms of castle architecture adapted to mountain terrain, created specialized cavalry formations for rapid raids, and pioneered the use of crossbows and other siege equipment. More importantly, they perfected the art of coalition warfare, learning to coordinate campaigns across multiple territories, despite political rivalries and territorial disputes. The economic foundations of these mountain societies also evolved during this period. Unable to rely on the extensive trade networks that enriched Al-Andalus, they developed more localized economies based on agriculture, pastoralism, and craft production. The famous merino sheep, whose wool would later make Castilian merchants wealthy, were first bred in these highland pastures. Iron mining in the Cantabrian mountains provided raw materials for weapons and tools. Most importantly, the capture and ransom of prisoners became a significant source of revenue, creating economic incentives for continued warfare. Religious life in the mountain territories developed its own distinctive character, blending Orthodox Catholic theology with local traditions and the practical demands of frontier existence. The cult of local saints flourished, with figures like San Emiliano becoming patron saints of particular communities or regions. Pilgrimage sites multiplied, creating networks of sacred geography that reinforced political and cultural unity. The development of the Santiago pilgrimage route brought international recognition and resources, but dozens of smaller shrines served similar functions for local populations. By the year 1000, the balance of power in Iberia had fundamentally shifted. While Al-Andalus remained wealthy and sophisticated, it was no longer expanding. The Highland territories, though still small and relatively poor, had established themselves as permanent fixtures on the peninsula. The age of desperate survival had given way to an era of cautious optimism, as rulers in Leon, Navarre, and Aragon began to contemplate not merely opposition, but reconquest. The transformation was evident in the artistic and literary production of these mountain courts. Churches built during this period, such as Santa Maria del Naranco near Oviedo, demonstrated sophisticated architectural knowledge that rivaled contemporary Carolingian and Byzantine work. The development of a distinctive Asturian artistic style, blending Visigothic, Carolingian, and local influences, signaled growing cultural confidence. Chronicles produced in monastery scriptoriums began to present not just local histories, but grand narratives that positioned the mountain rulers as rightful heirs to the entire Iberian Peninsula. The diplomatic correspondence of this period reveals rulers who saw themselves as players on the European stage. Alfonso III exchanged embassies with Charlemagne's successors, the Byzantine emperor, and even the Pope in Rome. These relationships brought not only material support, but also ideological legitimacy, as the mountain territories presented themselves as the defenders of Christendom against Islamic expansion. The concept of crusade, though not yet fully developed, was already taking shape in the propaganda and self-presentation of these highland courts. The stage was set for the next phase of this extraordinary struggle. In the palaces of Leon, kings studied maps that showed not just their current territories, but the lands they intended to reclaim. In the monasteries of the Camino, monks copied chronicles that portrayed the mountain rulers not as provincial chieftains, but as rightful heirs to the Gothic monarchy. In the valleys where it all began, a new generation of warriors prepared for campaigns that would transform the scattered realms of the north into the spearhead of a movement that would reshape not just Iberia, but the entire medieval world. The death of the great vizier Abi Amir, known to history as Almanzor, marked the beginning of the end for unified Arab rule in Iberia. For nearly 3 decades, this brilliant administrator and ruthless commander had held the Cordoba Caliphate together through sheer force of will, launching more than 50 campaigns against the defiant realms of the north. His armies had sacked Santiago de Compostela, destroyed Leon, and reduced the highland territories to desperate defensive struggles. Yet when he died in 1002, returning from what would be his final expedition, the entire edifice of centralized authority began to crumble with startling rapidity. Almanzor's son, Abd al-Malik, inherited his father's position, but not his political genius. The delicate balance of tribal loyalties, regional interests, and factional disputes that had sustained caliphal rule required constant attention and periodic adjustment. When Abd al-Malik died unexpectedly in 1008, the succession crisis that followed revealed the fundamental weakness of a system that depended entirely on personal charisma and administrative brilliance. The civil war that erupted in Al-Andalus, the fitna, as Arab chroniclers called it, lasted more than 2 decades and devastated the very foundations of authority in Iberia. Berbers from North Africa, who had provided the backbone of caliphal armies, turned against their Arab commanders. Slavic mercenaries, brought from Eastern Europe to serve as palace guards, established their own strongholds. Regional governors declared independence, transforming administrative districts into personal fiefdoms. By 1031, the last puppet caliph had been deposed, and the once mighty realm had shattered into more than 20 independent city-states. These successor states, known as petty kingdoms, from the Arabic word for faction, represented both the atomization of Arab authority and the flowering of a remarkable cultural renaissance. Freed from the conservative policies imposed by the caliphs, these monarchs competed with one another in patronizing poets, philosophers, scientists, and artists. The court of Seville, under the Abbadedes, became renowned for its literary salons, where Arabic poetry reached heights of sophistication. In the ancient Visigothic capital, scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic and Latin, creating an intellectual bridge between classical antiquity and medieval Europe. The Palace of the Alhambra in Granada, though built later, embodied the aesthetic ideals first developed in the competing courts. Yet this cultural flowering came at a terrible political price. The petty kings, lacking the resources and legitimacy of their caliphal predecessors, found themselves unable to mount effective campaigns against the resurgent powers of the north. Worse still, their mutual rivalries made coordinated defense impossible. When faced with pressure from the highland realms, individual monarchs often found it easier to purchase temporary peace through tribute payments than to risk costly warfare. The pariah system, regular tribute payments from Arab monarchs to their neighbours, fundamentally altered the balance of authority in Iberia. Gold from the mines of West Africa, which had once funded Caliphate armies, now flowed northward to fill the treasuries of Leon, Castile, and Navarre. This influx of wealth transformed the highland territories from poor mountain refuges into well-funded states capable of maintaining professional armies and ambitious building programs. The scale of tribute payments was staggering. The ancient Visigothic capital alone paid Alfonso VI an annual tribute of 10,000 gold pieces, while Seville provided similar amounts to various northern monarchs depending on the shifting balance of alliances. Badajoz, Granada, and Zaragoza all found themselves caught in webs of financial obligation that made them effectively vassals of their former enemies. Such payments represented far more than simple protection money. They constituted a systematic transfer of Arab wealth to northern coffers that funded the very campaigns that would ultimately destroy the fragmented system. The Romanesque churches that began appearing throughout the former frontier regions testified to this prosperity, their stone walls decorated with geometric patterns that reflected the complex cultural exchanges of the era. The Cathedral of Jaca, begun around 1070, incorporated architectural elements borrowed directly from Córdoba's Great Mosque. The Church of San Isidoro in Leon featured capitals carved with fantastic beasts and intricate foliage that showed clear influence from Arab decorative traditions. Such buildings were not merely places of worship, but statements of wealth and authority, demonstrating that the northern monarchs could now afford the kind of monumental architecture that had previously been the exclusive privilege of caliphal courts. The King of Leon, later known as the Great, proved to be the first monarch to fully exploit the opportunities. When he inherited Leon in 1037, the realm was still recovering from Almanzor's devastating campaigns. By the time of his death in 1065, the sovereign had not only restored his territories, but expanded them significantly southward, transforming his court into the wealthiest and most influential in the peninsula. His secret lay in understanding that the petty kings feared one another as much as they feared him. The diplomatic strategy was masterful in its cynicism. The Leonese king would ally with one petty kingdom against another, providing just enough support to prevent total victory, while ensuring that his chosen partner remained dependent on his continued favour. When the Abbadid monarch of Seville requested assistance against the rival realm of Badajoz, the northern sovereign provided troops in exchange for territorial concessions and increased tribute. When Granada sought protection from Seville's aggression, he gladly accepted their gold while positioning his own forces to benefit from the conflict's outcome. The complexity of such arrangements defied simple confessional categorization. The Leonese king maintained simultaneous alliances with the Arab monarchs of the ancient capital and Zaragoza, while conducting raids against the realm of Navarre. His court welcomed scholars and artisans, even as his armies besieged enemy cities. The chronicler Ibn Hayyan, writing in Córdoba, described him as the most cunning of the northern princes, who makes war and peace according to his convenience rather than his faith. The monarch's success lay in understanding that the petty kings feared absorption by their neighbours far more than they feared tributary status under a distant northern overlord. The sovereign of Badajoz would rather pay tribute to Leon than risk annexation by Seville. The master of the ancient capital preferred Leonese protection to potential domination by Zaragoza. The Leonese king positioned himself as the guarantor of this balance, ensuring that no single fragment became strong enough to threaten the others while gradually increasing his own influence over all of them. The transformation in warfare during the Leonese king's reign reflected changing realities. The desperate guerrilla tactics of earlier centuries gave way to more conventional siege operations, as the Highland realms could now afford to equip and maintain substantial forces for extended campaigns. The development of more sophisticated siege engines, including trebuchets and mangonels, demonstrated the influence of Arab engineering on northern practice. At the same time, the adoption of heavier cavalry armor and advanced sword designs showed European technological influence flowing southward. The emergence of Castile as an independent force marked another crucial development in this transformation. Originally a frontier county of Leon, Castile had developed its own distinctive character during the desperate struggles of the previous centuries. Its nobility, forged in constant border warfare, possessed a martial ethos that distinguished them from their counterparts in more established realms. The Castilian approach to warfare emphasized mobility, individual initiative, and rapid exploitation of opportunities, characteristics that would define Spanish culture for centuries to come. When Sancho III of Navarre conquered Leon in 1034 and granted Castile to his son, he unwittingly created the conditions for the emergence of the peninsula's most aggressive expansionist entity. The marriage to Sancha of Leon provided the legal foundation for his eventual claim to the Leonese throne, while his Castilian patrimony gave him a base independent of traditional Leonese noble interests. This combination of legitimacy and autonomy would prove crucial in subsequent territorial advances. The Castilian nobility that supported these ambitions represented a different type of aristocracy, one whose wealth and status derived primarily from battlefield success rather than inherited land. These men, many of whom traced their lineage to minor Visigothic nobles or even to successful mercenaries, viewed territorial advances as both a sacred duty and an economic opportunity. Their willingness to support costly campaigns reflected their understanding that warfare was the primary path to advancement in a society where traditional feudal hierarchies remained fluid. The development of the infanzonia, a class of minor nobles whose status derived from service rather than land ownership, exemplified this social transformation. These men, intermediate between the great magnates and the common soldiers, provided much of the leadership for frontier expeditions while serving as administrators in newly acquired territories. Their legal privileges, defined in various fueros and confirmed by royal charter, created incentives for continued advances while providing frameworks for incorporating conquered populations into northern society. The Castilian legal system, embodied in local fueros or charters, reflected the egalitarian traditions of frontier society. These documents granted extensive rights to settlers willing to populate dangerous border regions, creating communities where social mobility was possible through service, and where local assemblies held significant authority in municipal governance. The famous Fuero of Sepulveda, granted in 1076, promised that any knight who could hold land for a year and a day would be recognized as its rightful owner, a principle that encouraged aggressive advances while providing legal framework for territorial acquisition. The orders that emerged during this era represented another distinctive feature of Iberian society. The Order of Santiago, founded around 1170, and its counterparts in Calatrava and Alcántara, combined monastic vows with battlefield service in ways that had few parallels elsewhere in Europe. These warrior monks not only provided elite fighting forces, but also served crucial administrative functions, governing vast territories along the shifting frontier and organizing the settlement of conquered lands. Their commanderies became centers of agricultural innovation and economic development, transforming wilderness areas into productive farming regions. The figure of Rodrigo Diaz, known to history as El Cid, embodied the complexities and contradictions of this transitional era. Born into the minor nobility of Castile around 1043, Rodrigo rose to prominence through battlefield skill and political cunning that transcended the confessional boundaries supposedly defining the conflict. His early career in the service of Sancho II of Castile established his reputation as both a formidable warrior and a skilled diplomat, capable of negotiating with Arab monarchs as effectively as he could defeat them in battle. The circumstances of Rodrigo's exile from Castile in 1081 illuminate the complex factional struggles that characterized northern politics during this era. His dispute with Alfonso VI arose not from doctrinal differences, but from competing interpretations of royal authority and noble obligation. When Alfonso demanded that Rodrigo submit to what the knight considered unjust accusations, the resulting conflict reflected deeper tensions between traditional warrior values and the more centralized administrative systems that successful territorial advances required. Rodrigo's subsequent service with the Arab sovereign of Zaragoza represented far more than simple mercenary opportunism. His integration into Al-Mu'tamid's court, where he served alongside Arab commanders and participated in campaigns against both northern and southern opponents, demonstrated the fluid nature of political allegiances during the fragmented era. Contemporary chroniclers, both northern and southern, noted his ability to understand and respect Arab traditions while maintaining his own identity, a skill that proved invaluable in his later acquisition of Valencia. El Cid's career illustrates how individual ambition could reshape political alignments in ways that confounded simple narratives of sectarian warfare. His acquisition of Valencia in 1094, achieved through a careful combination of pressure and diplomatic negotiation, created an independent principality that served his personal interests rather than those of any particular faith or kingdom. Under his rule, Valencia became a cosmopolitan city where different communities coexisted under pragmatic arrangements that prioritized stability and prosperity over ideological purity. The administrative system that Rodrigo established in Valencia reflected his deep understanding of Arab governmental traditions, combined with northern legal principles. He retained many Arab officials in administrative positions while introducing northern legal procedures for disputes involving northern residents. The city's mosques continued to function alongside newly constructed churches, while Jewish scholars maintained their traditional role as intermediaries between different communities. This model of accommodation would influence northern governance throughout the peninsula during subsequent centuries of territorial advances. The intellectual ferment of this era produced lasting contributions to European civilization. The translation schools of the ancient capital, where scholars like Jihad of Cremona rendered Arabic texts into Latin, transmitted crucial works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine to the broader European world. These translations included not only commentaries on Aristotle, but also practical manuals on agriculture, engineering, and navigation that would influence European development for centuries to come. Meanwhile, in the petty kingdom courts, scholarship reached heights of sophistication. Ibn Hazm of Córdoba produced groundbreaking works on theology, philosophy, and comparative studies that challenged conventional wisdom and established methodological approaches to scholarly inquiry. In Seville, the mathematician Ibn Qura developed algebraic techniques that advanced understanding of quadratic equations. The physician Ibn Wafij of the ancient capital compiled medical texts that synthesized Greek, Arab, and local healing traditions, creating comprehensive guides to pharmaceutical practice that would be copied throughout Europe. The Almoravid intervention of 1086 temporarily disrupted these patterns of fragmentation and cultural exchange. When the petty monarchs of Seville and Badajoz, facing increasing pressure from Alfonso VI's expansionist campaigns, invited these North African fundamentalists to assist them, they inadvertently initiated a phase of doctrinal intensification that would transform the character of Arab rule in Iberia. Yet even before the Almoravids crossed the straits, the acquisition of the ancient capital in 1085 had already marked a psychological watershed in the long struggle for Iberian control. Alfonso VI's achievement represented more than territorial advance. It was a symbolic restoration of northern authority over the heartland of the peninsula. The city's fall sent shockwaves throughout the Arab world, while inspiring northern chroniclers to proclaim the beginning of the end for southern rule in Iberia. The capture of the ancient capital represented the culmination of decades of patient advances and diplomatic maneuvering. Alfonso VI's achievement reflected more than tactical superiority. It demonstrated the fundamental transformation of the balance of authority in central Iberia. The siege itself lasted only briefly, as Al-Qadir, the city's petty king, found himself abandoned by potential allies and facing internal rebellion from subjects who preferred accommodation with Alfonso to continued resistance. The symbolic significance of the ancient capital's fall resonated throughout both northern and southern worlds. For northern chroniclers, the achievement represented divine vindication of their long struggle against Arab rule. The cathedral that Alfonso immediately began constructing on the site of the city's principal mosque served as a physical manifestation of this perceived triumph. For Arab commentators, the ancient capital's loss signaled a catastrophic failure of political leadership that demanded immediate response from the broader community. Alfonso's administrative arrangements in conquered territory demonstrated the sophisticated governmental capabilities that the northern realms had developed during their era of advancement. Rather than attempting wholesale population replacement or cultural transformation, the Castilian king established a complex system of overlapping jurisdictions that preserved Arab legal traditions for southern residents, while introducing northern institutions for the growing population of settlers from the north. The famous fuero of the ancient capital, promulgated in 1101, codified these arrangements in ways that would influence legal development throughout the reconquered territories. The economic implications of the ancient capital's acquisition extended far beyond its immediate territorial value. The city controlled crucial trade routes connecting the central plateau with both the Mediterranean coast and the northern European markets accessible through the Pyrenean passes. Its workshops, famous throughout the medieval world for the quality of their steel production, now contributed to northern rather than southern capabilities. Most importantly, the tribute that the city had previously paid to Alfonso as an independent entity now flowed directly into royal coffers as taxation revenue from a conquered territory. The fall of the ancient capital also marked a crucial psychological watershed in the long struggle for Iberian control. The city's capture demonstrated that no southern territory, regardless of its historical significance or defensive strength, was secure from northern advances. This realization prompted desperate appeals for assistance from the broader Arab world, ultimately leading to the Almoravid intervention that would transform the character of sectarian conflict throughout the peninsula. The economic transformation that accompanied territorial advances fundamentally altered the character of northern society in the peninsula. The wealth generated by tribute payments and territorial acquisition funded ambitious building programs that transformed urban landscapes throughout the reconquered territories. The Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, rebuilt in magnificent Romanesque style during this era, symbolized not only devotion, but also the material prosperity that battlefield success had brought to the northern realms. Trade networks that had once been disrupted by constant warfare now flourished under more stable political conditions. Merchants from Italian city-states established commercial relationships with northern monarchs, providing access to Mediterranean markets while bringing financial techniques and commercial practices to Iberian towns. The introduction of agricultural technologies, often borrowed from Arab practice, increased productivity in formerly marginal lands and supported larger urban populations. The social changes accompanying this transformation were equally significant. The traditional warrior nobility of the frontier regions found their status enhanced by battlefield success and territorial acquisition. But they also faced challenges from emerging merchant classes and administrative officials, whose importance grew with the complexity of governing expanded territories. The legal systems that had evolved to meet the needs of frontier warfare required adaptation to the realities of ruling diverse populations with different backgrounds and cultural traditions. As the 11th century drew to a close, the political map of Iberia had been fundamentally redrawn. The mighty Caliphate of Córdoba had dissolved into competing fragments, while the northern realms had evolved from desperate mountain refugees into confident, expansionist entities. Yet the most dramatic changes lay ahead, as forces from both North Africa and Western Europe prepared to intervene in Iberian affairs, with consequences that would reshape not only the peninsula, but the broader medieval world. The stage was set for an intensification of sectarian conflict that would transform the pragmatic territorial disputes of the fragmented era into ideological crusades where competing visions of divine will would clash with unprecedented fury. In the palaces of Marrakesh, Almoravid leaders prepared to restore Arab unity through battlefield achievement and doctrinal purification. In the courts of France and Italy, northern knights heard tales of Spanish victories and began to dream of participating in what was increasingly understood as a holy war against the enemies of the faith. The desperate plea that reached Yusuf Tashfin in his capital of Marrakech carried the weight of impending catastrophe. Al-Mutamid of Seville, once the most influential of the petty kings, now found himself cornered by Alfonso VI's relentless advances. The fall of the ancient Visigothic capital had shattered any illusion that the fragmented realms could defend themselves independently. Faced with the choice between Castilian domination and Berber intervention, the Abadid sovereign chose what he hoped would be the lesser evil, famously declaring that he would rather be a camel driver in Africa than a swineherd in Castile. Yusuf Tashfin represented a dramatically different tradition from the sophisticated court culture that had flourished in Iberian territories. The desert warriors, literally those who prepare for holy war, had emerged from the harsh Sahara, where Berber tribes had embraced a puritanical interpretation of faith that viewed the luxury and theological flexibility of Andalusi courts as corruption requiring immediate correction. Their movement had begun in the Ribats, fortified monasteries along the Atlantic coast of Morocco, where warrior monks combined ascetic devotion with readiness for battle, opposing any who threatened the purity of their beliefs. The Berber leader who crossed the straits in 1086 brought with him not merely an army, but an entirely different conception of governance and society, where the petty kings had ruled through pragmatic accommodation and cultural synthesis. Yusuf Tashfin imposed strict interpretation of law, demolished wine shops, burned musical instruments, and executed those he deemed guilty of moral corruption. His troops, hardened by decades of desert warfare, and motivated by genuine conviction that they were fighting for divine favor, proved devastatingly effective in opposition to opponents who had grown accustomed to the ritualized conflicts of the fragmented era. The confrontation at Sagrajas in October 1086 marked the first major reversal that the Highland realms had suffered in decades. Alfonso VI, confident after his recent triumphs, led a substantial army southward, expecting another profitable expedition. Instead, he encountered an enemy unlike any he had faced before. The Berber troops, supplemented by soldiers from the surviving petty kingdoms, employed tactics refined in African desert warfare. Their famous war drums thundered throughout the battlefield, while veiled warriors charged with a fanaticism that unnerved even veteran Castilian knights. The battle itself unfolded as a masterpiece of tactical coordination. Yusuf Tashfin positioned his armies to exploit the overconfidence that had characterized the king's recent expeditions. When the Castilian cavalry charged, they found themselves facing not the fragmented resistance they expected, but a unified enemy that had prepared elaborate defensive positions. The Berber mounted archers, using tactics perfected in opposition to Saharan nomads, harassed the Castilian troops while avoiding direct engagement until exhaustion made their opponents vulnerable to decisive assault. The king barely escaped with his life, his army shattered and his reputation for invincibility destroyed. The psychological impact of Sagrajas resonated throughout both sides of the conflict. For the Highland realms, it demonstrated that their recent successes could be reversed by sufficiently motivated opposition. For the Iberian territories, it suggested that unified resistance under proper leadership could halt what had seemed inevitable Castilian advance. Yet the Berber intervention brought consequences that the petty kings had not anticipated. Yusuf initially honored his agreements with his Andalusi allies, but as he observed their courts more closely, his conviction grew that these monarchs were as much enemies of true faith as their Castilian opponents. The refined poetry, philosophical speculation, and cultural tolerance that had characterized the fragmented kingdoms appeared to the desert purist as evidence of spiritual decay, requiring radical remedy. Within a few years, the Berber leader had deposed most of the petty kings who had invited his intervention. Al-Mutamid of Seville, who had initiated the appeal for African assistance, found himself exiled to a remote village in the Atlas Mountains, where he spent his final years composing melancholy verses about the paradise he had lost. The sophisticated court culture that had produced some of the finest achievements in Andalusi civilization vanished almost overnight, replaced by an austere regime that prioritized doctrinal purity over intellectual exploration. The transformation of Al-Andalus under Almoravid rule represented more than a change of dynasty. It constituted a fundamental reorientation of southern society toward North African models. The new rulers dismantled the complex networks of accommodation that had allowed different communities to coexist, imposing instead rigid hierarchies based on strict interpretation of law. Jewish scholars who had flourished under the petty kings found themselves facing persecution and forced conversion. Mozarab populations that had maintained their identity under Arab rule discovered that Berber fundamentalism offered no space for such compromise. This doctrinal intensification had profound implications for the character of the ongoing conflict. Where previous warfare had often involved pragmatic alliances that crossed confessional boundaries, the Almoravid presence transformed the struggle into something approaching genuine holy war. The puritanical fervor of the new southern regime left little room for the kind of diplomatic flexibility that had characterized relations during the fragmented era. Simultaneously, developments in Western Europe were creating parallel changes in northern attitudes toward the Iberian conflict. The success of the First Crusade in capturing Jerusalem had demonstrated the potential for coordinated campaigns against what European chroniclers increasingly described as the enemies of Christendom. Pope Urban II's call for holy war in the East had awakened enthusiasm for similar efforts closer to home, particularly as news of Almoravid victories suggested that the gains of recent decades might be imperiled. The concept of crusade began to take shape in Iberian context during this era, though the full development of crusading ideology would require several more decades. French knights who had participated in the Eastern expeditions brought with them both tactical innovations and ideological frameworks that gradually transformed northern approaches to warfare against southern opponents. The military orders that emerged during this time, Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara, embodied this synthesis of monastic devotion and battlefield commitment in ways that directly paralleled the crusading orders established in the Holy Land. Alfonso I of Aragon, known as the Battler, exemplified this new generation of northern monarchs who combined territorial ambitions with genuine conviction that their campaigns served divine purposes. His marriage to Urraca of Leon Castile, though ultimately unsuccessful in personal terms, created the potential for unified northern action against the Almoravid threat. Alfonso's military campaigns demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of this crusading approach. The Aragonese king's most famous expedition, his raid deep into Andalusi territory that reached the Mediterranean coast near Granada, illustrated both the capabilities that the northern realms had developed and the challenges they faced in converting tactical success into lasting territorial gains. Alfonso's forces penetrated farther south than any northern army had achieved since the original Arab conquest, liberating thousands of Mozarab captives and demonstrating that even the Almoravid heartland was vulnerable to determined assault. Yet Alfonso's inability to hold his conquests revealed the continuing limitations of northern resources when faced with the vast territories and substantial populations that remained under southern control. The Aragonese expedition succeeded as a raid, but failed as a campaign of permanent occupation. The liberated Mozarabs, relocated to northern territories, brought valuable knowledge and skills, but also served as reminders of the communities that remained under increasingly oppressive southern rule. In Portugal, Afonso Henriques pursued a different strategy that would prove more sustainable in the long term. Rather than attempting dramatic expeditions into the southern heartland, the Portuguese count focused on methodical advance along the Atlantic coast, capturing territory that could be effectively defended and populated by settlers from the north. His victory at Urique in 1139, though probably less miraculous than later chroniclers claimed, established Portuguese independence and demonstrated the effectiveness of patient, systematic territorial acquisition. The Portuguese approach to warfare against the Almoravids emphasized the coordination of naval and land forces in ways that exploited the extensive coastline of western Iberia. Afonso Henriques developed relationships with Italian city-states and northern European powers that provided both technical assistance and ideological support for his campaigns. The capture of Lisbon in 1147, achieved with crucial assistance from northern European crusaders en route to the Second Crusade, marked a turning point in Portuguese fortunes and established patterns of international cooperation that would characterize later phases of the Reconquest. Meanwhile, the Almoravid regime in Al-Andalus faced its own internal challenges that would ultimately prove more dangerous than northern military pressure. The puritanical fervor that had initially unified the Berber tribes began to fragment as success brought wealth and administrative responsibilities that conflicted with ascetic ideals. The urban populations of Al-Andalus never entirely reconciled to Almoravid rule, increasingly resented the cultural restrictions and economic burdens imposed by their North African overlords. More significantly, a new fundamentalist movement was emerging in the Atlas Mountains that viewed the Almoravids themselves as corrupted by contact with Andalusi luxury. The Almohads, those who proclaim the unity of God, developed an even more rigorous interpretation of doctrine that condemned not only the cultural synthesis of the petty kingdoms, but also the accommodations that the Almoravids had made with existing Andalusi institutions. The rise of the Almohads represented the logical culmination of the puritanical impulse that had driven the Almoravid intervention. Where the earlier movement had sought to purify Al-Andalus of its cultural accommodations, the newer faction aimed to eliminate any compromise with what they considered theological error. Their leader, Ibn Tumat, proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the divinely guided reformer whose appearance would herald the final triumph of true faith over corruption and error. The Almohad revolution unfolded with devastating effectiveness throughout North Africa during the 1120s and 1330s. Their forces, motivated by conviction that they were participating in the final cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, proved even more formidable than their Almoravid predecessors. By 1147, they had crossed into Al-Andalus and begun the systematic destruction of Almoravid authority throughout the peninsula. The transition from Almoravid to Almohad rule represented an intensification rather than a moderation of fundamentalist governance in Al-Andalus. The new regime imposed even stricter interpretations of law, persecuted Jewish and Christian communities with greater severity, and eliminated the remaining traces of the cultural synthesis that had characterized earlier Andalusi civilization. The philosophical and scientific achievements that had flourished under the petty kingdoms became suspect as potential sources of theological error requiring suppression. Yet this very extremism created opportunities for the northern realms that more moderate southern leadership might have avoided. The harshness of Almohad rule alienated substantial portions of the Andalusi population, creating potential allies for northern forces and undermining the social cohesion that effective resistance required. The destruction of traditional local leadership structures left many communities without effective organization for defense against northern advances. Alfonso VII of Leon Castile proved particularly adept at exploiting these opportunities. His campaigns during the 1140s and 1150s combined traditional territorial objectives with the newer crusading ideology in ways that attracted both international support and papal blessing. The emperor, as he styled himself, positioned his efforts as part of the broader European struggle against what crusading propaganda increasingly characterized as the forces of darkness. The siege of Almeria in 1147, conducted simultaneously with the Second Crusade, demonstrated the potential for coordinating Iberian campaigns with broader European crusading efforts. Alfonso VII's forces, supplemented by Italian naval assistance and French knightly contingents, captured this crucial Mediterranean port and held it for a decade before Almohad counterattacks forced its abandonment. Though ultimately unsuccessful in permanent terms, the Almeria campaign established precedents for international cooperation that would influence later phases of the Reconquest. The development of the Santiago pilgrimage route during this era provided another crucial link between Iberian and broader European developments. The Camino de Santiago had become one of Christianity's most important pilgrimage destinations, attracting thousands of travelers annually who brought not only economic benefits, but also news, ideas, and potential military assistance. The military orders that guarded the pilgrimage routes developed into formidable fighting forces, while maintaining the international connections that made them valuable allies for northern monarchs. The Order of Santiago, founded around 1170, embodied the synthesis of monastic devotion and military capability that characterized this phase of the Reconquest. Unlike the military orders established in the Holy Land, the Iberian orders developed specifically to meet the challenges of frontier warfare against highly motivated opponents who possessed substantial resources and sophisticated military capabilities. These warrior monks became crucial elements in northern strategy, providing elite fighting forces while serving administrative functions in newly conquered territories. The cultural implications of this intensified conflict extended far beyond immediate military concerns. The destruction of Andalusi intellectual life under successive waves of North African Puritanism eliminated one of medieval Europe's most important centers of learning and cultural synthesis. The translation schools that had transmitted classical knowledge from Arabic into Latin largely disappeared, while the philosophical and scientific traditions that had flourished under more tolerant regimes faced systematic suppression. Yet this very destruction created incentives for scholars and intellectuals to seek refuge in northern territories, bringing with them knowledge and skills that would enrich the courts of Leon, Castile, and Aragon. The cultural synthesis that had been eliminated from Al-Andalus began to re-emerge in northern contexts, though without the sophisticated urban environments that had supported its original development. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 marked the decisive turning point in this phase of intensified conflict. The Almohad Caliph al-Nasir had assembled what contemporary sources described as the largest army ever gathered in Al-Andalus, drawing troops not only from throughout the peninsula, but also from across North Africa. His objective was nothing less than the complete elimination of northern resistance and the restoration of unified control over the entire peninsula. Alfonso VIII of Castile responded by creating an equally unprecedented coalition that included not only the other northern monarchs, but also substantial contingents of crusading knights from beyond the Pyrenees. Pope Innocent III had proclaimed the campaign a legitimate crusade, granting participants the same spiritual benefits offered to those who fought in the Holy Land. The international character of the Christian forces reflected the extent to which the Iberian conflict had become integrated with broader European crusading ideology. The battle itself unfolded as a contest between two radically different approaches to warfare and society. The Almohad forces represented the culmination of North African military traditions, with elaborate tactical formations and sophisticated siege equipment designed to exploit their numerical superiority. The Christian coalition combined traditional Iberian cavalry tactics with innovations learned from decades of crusading experience in the East. The decisive moment came when the Christian heavy cavalry, led by the military orders, broke through the Almohad center and reached the caliph's own position. Al-Nasir's flight from the battlefield triggered the collapse of his entire army, transforming what had begun as an orderly withdrawal into a catastrophic rout. The psychological impact of this defeat proved even more significant than its immediate military consequences, shattering the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Almohad arms, and demonstrating that even the most fanatical opponents could be decisively defeated. The aftermath of Las Navas de Tolosa marked the beginning of the end for unified resistance to northern advance. The Almohad Empire, already strained by rebellions in North Africa, never recovered from the loss of prestige and resources that the Iberian defeat represented. Within a generation, their authority throughout Al-Andalus had collapsed, leaving only the Kingdom of Granada as a remnant of what had once been the dominant force in southern Iberia. Yet the victory at Las Navas de Tolosa represented more than military triumph. It marked the transformation of the Reconquest from a struggle for survival into a movement for complete territorial recovery. The northern realms had demonstrated their ability to coordinate efforts on an unprecedented scale while attracting international support for their cause. The stage was set for the final phase of territorial advance that would reduce Al-Andalus to a single kingdom, clinging to the mountainous regions of the far south. The crusading ideology that had shaped this phase of the conflict would continue to influence northern approaches to governance and expansion. But the desperate fundamentalism that had characterized Almoravid and Almohad rule would give way to more pragmatic arrangements as the remaining southern territories faced the choice between accommodation and extinction. The age of holy war was drawing to a close, though its consequences would continue to shape Iberian civilization for centuries to come. The collapse of the Great Coalition at Las Navas de Tolosa sent shockwaves across the remaining lands of Al-Andalus that would never fully subside. Within a generation, the seemingly invincible empire that had dominated Iberian affairs for over a century lay in ruins, its North African provinces racked by rebellion, while its Spanish possessions fragmented into warring city-states. The psychological impact proved even more devastating than the immediate tactical consequences. For the first time since the original conquest, the ultimate triumph of the northern realms seemed not merely possible, but inevitable. The Saint, later known by this title, inherited this transformed landscape when he ascended to the throne in 1217. Unlike his predecessors, who had fought primarily to defend their lands or extract tribute from weaker neighbors, this monarch faced the unprecedented opportunity to achieve what had seemed impossible for 5 centuries: the complete restoration of the old Visigothic realm under a single crown. The young sovereign possessed not only the material resources accumulated through generations of successful warfare, but also the moral authority that came from leading what was increasingly understood as a divinely sanctioned mission. The first decades of the reign were spent consolidating the gains achieved at Las Navas, while preparing for the systematic reduction of the remaining strongholds. The approach to this final phase of recovery differed markedly from the opportunistic raiding that had characterized earlier periods. Instead of seeking immediate profit through tribute extraction or temporary occupation, the sovereign's advisors developed comprehensive strategies for permanent incorporation of conquered lands into the expanding realm. The assault on Córdoba in 1236 marked the beginning of this systematic approach. The ancient capital of the Caliphate, which had once rivaled Baghdad as a center of learning and refinement, now found itself isolated and vulnerable after decades of civil war and economic decline. The king's forces combined traditional techniques with innovative approaches that reflected the increasingly sophisticated nature of warfare. The defenders, lacking both the resources and the unified command that had characterized earlier resistance, could offer only token opposition to the methodical advance of the besieging armies. The fall of Córdoba resonated across both sides of the conflict, with symbolic significance that transcended its immediate strategic value. For the northern realms, the capture of the former Caliphate capital represented divine vindication of their centuries-long struggle, while demonstrating that no Arab stronghold, regardless of its historical importance, remained secure from their advance. For the remaining defenders of Al-Andalus, Córdoba's loss symbolized the irreversible collapse of their political and cultural world. The administration of conquered Córdoba established patterns that would guide policy in all subsequent acquisitions. Rather than attempting wholesale population replacement or cultural transformation, the authorities implemented selective policies that preserved existing economic structures while introducing new political institutions. The famous library, though reduced from its former glory, was permitted to continue functioning under supervision. Arab courts retained jurisdiction over personal status matters, affecting the substantial population that chose to remain under the new regime. The economic integration of Córdoba into the realm demonstrated the sophisticated administrative capabilities that the kingdom had developed over its long expansion. Officials established new tax collection systems that generated substantial revenue, while avoiding the kind of oppressive extraction that might provoke rebellion. The renowned artisan workshops, famous across Europe for the quality of their leather goods and metalwork, were encouraged to maintain production under new management structures that ensured oversight while preserving traditional craft knowledge. Meanwhile, in the eastern regions, James I of Aragon was pursuing a parallel campaign of acquisition that would establish Aragonese control over the Mediterranean coast. Known to history as the Conqueror, James combined the prowess of his mountain ancestors with diplomatic skills that enabled him to forge alliances with Italian maritime republics, French noble houses, and even Arab rulers who saw cooperation as preferable to destruction. The conquest of Majorca in 1229 demonstrated the reach and sophistication of Aragonese naval capabilities. The island had served as a base for corsairs who disrupted Mediterranean trade, while providing refuge for Arab forces fleeing mainland defeats. James's expedition represented one of the largest amphibious operations attempted in medieval Europe, requiring coordination between land and sea forces on an unprecedented scale. The successful capture of the island's capital after prolonged resistance established Aragonese dominance over the western Mediterranean, while providing a strategic base for future operations. The administrative system that James established in conquered Majorca reflected the cosmopolitan character of Mediterranean commerce in this era. The island's strategic position made it a natural center for trade between Europe, North Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean. Rather than disrupting commercial networks, the Aragonese authorities created legal frameworks that protected merchants from different backgrounds while ensuring taxation of profitable trade. Jewish financiers, Arab craftsmen, and Christian merchants continued to operate within overlapping jurisdictions that prioritized economic prosperity over religious uniformity. The siege of Valencia, beginning in 1238, represented perhaps the most significant achievement of James's reign. The city had been the capital of El Cid's independent principality 2 centuries earlier, and its recapture carried enormous symbolic weight for those who viewed the current conflicts as continuation of that earlier struggle. More importantly, Valencia controlled access to some of the most fertile agricultural land in the peninsula, while serving as the primary port for trade with North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. The complexity of Valencia's siege reflected both the city's formidable defenses and the sophisticated nature of 13th century warfare. Islamic engineers had strengthened the fortifications repeatedly during previous centuries, creating multiple lines of defense that could resist traditional assault techniques. James's forces employed advanced siege equipment, including massive trebuchets and sophisticated undermining operations, while coordinating their efforts with naval blockades that prevented resupply from North African allies. The eventual surrender of Valencia after a siege lasting over a year established Aragonese control over the entire eastern coast, from the Pyrenees to modern Alicante. The terms of capitulation reflected James's reputation for honoring agreements. Islamic residents who chose to remain were guaranteed protection of their property and religious practices, while those who preferred to leave were permitted to depart with their movable possessions. This policy of selective tolerance would become characteristic of Aragonese administration throughout their Mediterranean territories. The demographic transformation that followed these conquests posed unprecedented challenges for both Castilian and Aragonese administrators. The Highland realms, despite their territorial expansion, remained relatively small in population compared to the vast territories they now controlled. Effective governance required not only military occupation, but also the settlement of sufficient numbers of reliable colonists to ensure long-term stability and cultural integration. The repopulation policies developed during this period represented sophisticated attempts to balance competing priorities. Royal authorities needed to reward the noble families and military orders whose support had made conquest possible, while also attracting sufficient numbers of ordinary settlers to maintain agricultural production and urban commerce. The solution involved complex arrangements that granted large estates to major nobles while reserving smaller holdings for individual settlers willing to accept frontier conditions. The military orders played crucial roles in this colonization process. The orders of Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara received vast territorial grants in exchange for commitments to defend and populate assigned regions. These warrior monks possessed both the military capabilities necessary for frontier defense and the administrative experience required for managing complex agricultural estates. Their commanderies became centers of settlement that attracted colonists while providing security for vulnerable frontier communities. The legal frameworks governing these new territories reflected centuries of experience with diverse populations and competing jurisdictions. The fueros granted to newly established communities typically guaranteed extensive local autonomy while requiring military service and loyalty to the crown. These charters created incentives for settlement by offering favorable terms to colonists willing to accept the risks of frontier life, including reduced taxation, judicial privileges, and guarantees of personal freedom. The cultural implications of this massive territorial expansion extended far beyond immediate administrative concerns. The Highland realms found themselves governing populations that included substantial numbers of Muslims, Jews, and Mozarab Christians, whose traditions and loyalties differed significantly from those of their new rulers. The development of stable, prosperous societies in these circumstances required institutional innovations that had few precedents in medieval Europe. The Mudajar system that emerged from these practical necessities represented a unique solution to the challenges of governing religiously diverse populations. Islamic communities that accepted Castilian or Aragonese sovereignty were permitted to maintain their religious practices, legal traditions, and local leadership structures while accepting ultimate royal authority. This arrangement provided stability and continuity for existing populations while generating substantial tax revenue for the crown. The economic benefits of these territorial acquisitions transformed both Castile and Aragon into major European powers. The agricultural wealth of the Guadalquivir Valley, combined with the commercial advantages of controlling Mediterranean trade routes, provided resources on a scale that dwarfed anything the Highland realms had previously possessed. Royal revenues increased dramatically, enabling ambitious building programs, expanded military establishments, and diplomatic initiatives that projected Iberian influence throughout Europe. The Cathedral of Burgos, begun during this period, exemplified the confidence and resources that territorial success had brought to Castilian society. This magnificent structure, incorporating architectural influences from France while maintaining distinctively Iberian characteristics, served as both a religious center and a symbol of royal power. Its construction required craftsmen, materials, and financial resources from throughout Europe, demonstrating the extent to which successful conquest had integrated the Highland realms into broader continental networks. Ferdinand III's capture of Seville in 1248 marked the culmination of Castilian territorial expansion during this period. The city had served as the de facto capital of Islamic resistance since the fall of Córdoba, and its surrender left only Granada as a significant center of Islamic power in the peninsula. The siege of Seville required 2 years of patient effort, as the city's location on the Guadalquivir River provided natural defensive advantages, while its wealth enabled prolonged resistance. The final assault on Seville demonstrated the sophisticated military capabilities that the Castilian forces had developed through decades of successful warfare. Royal engineers constructed a bridge of boats across the Guadalquivir, cutting off the city's river access while enabling coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The defenders, led by the capable Axataf, mounted fierce resistance that included innovative use of Greek fire and coordinated sorties designed to break the siege lines. The terms of Seville's surrender reflected both Ferdinand's reputation for honoring agreements and the realities of governing a large Islamic population. Muslims who chose to remain were guaranteed protection, while those who preferred to leave were provided safe passage to North African territories. The majority chose emigration, creating opportunities for extensive Christian settlement, while avoiding the potential problems associated with governing a hostile urban population. The transformation of Seville under Castilian rule exemplified the cultural synthesis that characterized this period of territorial integration. The city's great mosque was converted into a cathedral, but the stunning minaret was preserved and later incorporated into the famous Giralda Tower. Islamic architectural elements were combined with Gothic innovations to create a distinctive style that would influence construction throughout southern Iberia. Jewish intellectuals who had faced persecution under fundamentalist Islamic regimes found new opportunities for scholarship and commercial activity. The diplomatic revolution that accompanied these territorial gains reflected the emergence of Castile and Aragon as significant players in European politics. Marriage alliances connected the Iberian royal houses to their counterparts in France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. Commercial agreements opened new markets for Iberian products while providing access to advanced technologies and financial techniques developed in Italian city-states and Flemish commercial centres. The papacy's recognition of Ferdinand III as a model Christian ruler provided international legitimacy for Castilian expansion, while encouraging continued efforts toward complete territorial recovery. Papal bulls granted spiritual benefits to those who supported the Iberian campaigns, while diplomatic correspondence praised Ferdinand's combination of military success with charitable treatment of conquered populations. This international recognition enhanced Castilian prestige while providing ideological justification for continued expansion. Yet these very successes created new challenges that would test the administrative capabilities of both Castile and Aragon during the latter part of the 13th century. The vast territories now under Christian control required governance systems capable of managing diverse populations, complex economic relationships, and competing regional interests. The solutions developed during this period would establish precedents that would influence Iberian political development for centuries to come. The emergence of the Cortes as representative institutions reflected the need for consultation between royal authorities and the communities responsible for defending and populating newly conquered territories. These assemblies provided forums for negotiating tax assessments, military obligations, and judicial privileges, while giving local elites formal roles in royal administration. The development of representative government in Iberia preceded similar institutions in most other European kingdoms by several decades. The legal codification projects undertaken during this period represented attempts to create unified systems of law capable of governing territories with different traditions and populations. The Siete Partidas, commissioned by Alfonso X of Castile, synthesized Roman law, canon law, and local customs into a comprehensive legal code that would influence Iberian jurisprudence for centuries. Similar efforts in Aragon created institutional frameworks for managing the complex federal relationships between the crown and its various territories. As the 13th century drew to a close, the political map of Iberia had been fundamentally transformed. The vast territories that had once constituted Al-Andalus had been reduced to the single kingdom of Granada, clinging to the mountainous regions of the far south through a combination of natural defenses, diplomatic skill, and tribute payments to their Christian neighbors. The age of Islamic dominance in Iberia had ended, though the cultural legacies of 8 centuries of coexistence would continue to influence peninsular civilization for generations to come. The highland realms that had begun as desperate refugees in remote mountain valleys had evolved into major European powers, capable of projecting influence throughout the Mediterranean world. Their success in achieving what had seemed impossible, the systematic recovery of territories lost to Islamic conquest, would inspire later generations of Europeans to attempt similar projects in other regions. The techniques of conquest, colonization, and cultural integration developed during the Iberian Reconquest would provide models for European expansion that would ultimately reshape the entire world. The dawn of the 14th century found Iberia poised on the brink of completing what had seemed impossible when Pelayo first took refuge in the caves of Covadonga. 600 years of struggle had reduced the once mighty realm of Al-Andalus to a single kingdom clinging to the mountainous regions of the south, surviving through a combination of natural defenses, diplomatic cunning, and tribute payments that acknowledged its subordinate status. Yet the final act of this extraordinary drama would be delayed for nearly 200 years by internal strife, dynastic disputes, and foreign entanglements that prevented the northern realms from delivering the decisive blow that would complete their recovery. The intervening decades witnessed a complex interplay of consolidation and conflict that shaped the character of the emerging Spanish state. The vast lands won in the 13th century required generations of administrative development before they could be effectively integrated into unified political structures. The crown of Castile, now stretching from the Cantabrian coast to the Guadalquivir Valley, encompassed regions with radically different traditions, economies, and populations that demanded careful management to prevent fragmentation. The Mudéjar populations that had remained under northern rule presented both opportunities and challenges for administrators. These communities possessed valuable agricultural and artisanal skills while maintaining cultural traditions that enriched the increasingly diverse society emerging in the reconquered regions. Yet their ultimate loyalty remained questionable, particularly when the southern kingdom launched raids into the northern lands, or when rumors spread of Ottoman assistance for resistance movements. The southern kingdom itself had evolved into something unique in the medieval world, an Arab state that survived through a combination of warfare capability, diplomatic flexibility, and economic accommodation with its northern neighbors. The Nasrid dynasty that ruled from the magnificent Alhambra Palace had transformed what might have been a temporary refuge into a sophisticated political entity capable of playing the larger powers against one another, while maintaining sufficient strength to deter casual aggression. The civil wars that racked Castile throughout much of the 14th century demonstrated both the kingdom's internal tensions and its fundamental resilience. Succession disputes, noble rebellions, and foreign interventions repeatedly threatened to fragment the carefully constructed unity that generations of warfare had achieved. The arrival of the Black Death in the middle of the century added demographic catastrophe to political chaos. killing perhaps 1/3 of the population and disrupting the economic foundations upon which authority depended. Yet these very crises forced institutional innovations that would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken the monarchy's position. The Cortes assemblies that had emerged over the expansion era evolved into forums for negotiating between crown and subjects, while new legal codes established uniform procedures for governing diverse populations. The Church, enriched by warfare and motivated by crusading ideology, provided both spiritual legitimacy and administrative expertise for governance. The Portuguese path toward unity followed a different trajectory that would ultimately position that kingdom as a pioneer in Atlantic exploration. The marriage politics of the 14th and 15th eras repeatedly threatened to merge Portugal with Castile, creating the possibility of unified Iberian rule under a single dynasty. Yet Portuguese resistance to these unions, culminating in the decisive victory at Aljubarrota in 1385, established patterns of independence that would enable the smaller kingdom to pursue its own imperial destiny. The Aragonese crown faced equally complex challenges in managing its Mediterranean empire while maintaining control over its Iberian territories. The conquest of Sicily, Sardinia, and parts of southern Italy had created a commercial network that generated substantial wealth while requiring constant military attention to defend against French and Ottoman threats. The delicate balance between peninsular and Mediterranean interests would influence Aragonese policy throughout the late medieval period. The emergence of powerful noble families in this era created both obstacles and opportunities for authority. Houses like the Mendoza, Enriquez, and Velasco accumulated vast estates and private armies that could challenge power, while simultaneously providing the armed forces and financial resources necessary for effective governance. The crown's success in co-opting, rather than destroying these magnates, would prove crucial for the eventual unification of Iberian lands under a single dynasty. The economic transformation that accompanied consolidation fundamentally altered the character of Iberian society. The wool trade that connected Castilian pastures with Flemish textile production generated wealth on an unprecedented scale, while Mediterranean commerce enriched the merchant communities of Barcelona, Valencia, and Seville. The discovery of silver deposits in newly won regions provided the monetary foundation for ambitious building projects and campaigns that enhanced prestige throughout Europe. The intellectual and cultural developments of this era reflected the complex heritage of warfare and coexistence that characterized Iberian civilization. The translation schools of Toledo continued their work of transmitting classical knowledge, while new universities at Salamanca, Alcalá, and elsewhere became centers of scholastic learning that rivaled the great institutions of Paris and Oxford. The distinctive architectural styles that emerged from the synthesis of Arab, Northern, and Jewish traditions created monuments whose beauty would inspire admiration for generations to come. The gradual crystallization of Spanish identity over these generations involved the selective appropriation of elements from all the peninsula's cultural traditions. The Castilian language, enriched by Arabic vocabulary and influenced by the rhythms of Andalusi poetry, emerged as the dominant literary medium, while regional dialects maintained their vitality in local contexts. The legal traditions that evolved from the interaction of Roman law, Germanic customs, Arab jurisprudence, and local fueros created hybrid systems that would influence colonial administration throughout the Americas. The reign of Isabella and Ferdinand marked the culmination of generations of gradual unification under a partnership that combined personal affection with calculated political advantage. Their marriage in 1469 created the potential for unified rule over most of northern Iberia, while preserving the distinct institutional traditions that had evolved in each kingdom. The careful balance they maintained between centralization and regional autonomy provided a model for governing diverse lands that would prove invaluable for subsequent imperial expansion. The internal reforms undertaken by Isabella and Ferdinand reflected their understanding that effective rule required more than armed victory. The establishment of the Santa Hermandad provided justice in remote areas where noble authority had previously been supreme. The reorganization of finances eliminated the chronic deficits that had weakened previous rulers while generating resources sufficient for ambitious projects. The reform of the church hierarchy ensured that ecclesiastical wealth and influence served the crown rather than papal objectives. The consolidation of authority created the preconditions for the final assault on the southern kingdom that would complete the recovery begun 800 years earlier. Unlike previous campaigns that had been motivated primarily by opportunities for plunder or tribute extraction, the war represented a systematic effort to eliminate the last vestige of Arab rule in Iberia. The sovereigns possessed both the resources and the institutional capabilities necessary for sustained warfare against a well-defended opponent. The Granada War began in 1482, not as a dramatic declaration of intent, but as a response to frontier incidents that escalated beyond the normal patterns of raid and counter-raid. The capture of Zahara by Granadan forces, followed by the Christian seizure of Alhama, created a cycle of violence that made peaceful resolution increasingly difficult. Yet both sides initially assumed that the conflict would follow traditional patterns of limited warfare, punctuated by truces and tributary arrangements. The systematic nature of the Christian advance soon demonstrated that this campaign would be different from all previous encounters. Instead of seeking rapid conquests followed by withdrawal, the Catholic monarchs committed to methodical reduction of Granada's defensive network through a combination of sieges, diplomatic pressure, and economic warfare. Each captured fortress was immediately garrisoned and integrated into a defensive system designed to prevent reconquest. The technological innovations that characterized this final campaign reflected the revolution in military engineering that was transforming European warfare. The introduction of gunpowder artillery fundamentally altered siege tactics by enabling attackers to breach even the strongest fortifications within manageable timeframes. The Catholic monarchs employed Italian engineers and German artillery specialists whose expertise complemented traditional Iberian siege techniques. The Siege of Malaga in 1487 demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of this new military technology. The port city's formidable defences, strengthened by Ottoman engineers, required a 4-month blockade that combined naval operations with systematic artillery bombardment. The eventual capitulation provided the Christian forces with their most important strategic victory, while demonstrating to other Granadan strongholds the futility of prolonged resistance. The internal divisions that weakened Granada during its final decades reflected the broader crisis of Islamic political authority that characterized the late medieval period. The rivalry between the last Nasrid rulers, particularly the conflict between Boabdil and his uncle Al-Zagal, provided opportunities for Christian intervention while preventing effective coordination of defensive efforts. The Catholic monarchs exploited these factional disputes through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic manipulation that gradually isolated each Granadan leader from potential allies. The economic blockade that accompanied the military campaign proved equally devastating to Granadan resistance. The systematic capture of ports eliminated maritime connections with North Africa, while the occupation of agricultural regions reduced the food supplies available for feeding urban populations. The disruption of trade networks that had sustained Granada's economy for centuries created internal pressures that made continued resistance increasingly difficult. The cultural policies pursued by the Catholic monarchs during the Granada War revealed the complex motivations underlying their campaign. While military necessity demanded harsh measures against active opponents, the monarchs also sought to position themselves as legitimate successors to the Islamic rulers they were displacing. The preservation of Islamic architectural monuments and the protection of non-combatant populations demonstrated an understanding that effective rule required accommodation as well as conquest. The final siege of Granada itself, beginning in 1491, represented the culmination of a decade of systematic warfare that had eliminated every alternative to surrender. The city's position in the fertile Vega, surrounded by mountains that provided natural defenses, had enabled it to resist previous assaults for centuries. Yet the methodical capture of outlying fortresses had eliminated the defensive network upon which Granada's security depended. The construction of the siege city of Santa Fe demonstrated both the resources at the Catholic monarch's disposal and their determination to complete the conquest, regardless of the time and expense required. This permanent camp, complete with stone walls and regular streets, served notice that the Christian forces would maintain their blockade indefinitely. The psychological impact of this demonstration proved as important as its military function in convincing Granada's defenders that further resistance was futile. The terms of capitulation agreed upon in November 1491 reflected the complex negotiations that had characterized the final months of the siege. The Treaty of Granada guaranteed protection for Islamic religious practices, legal traditions, and property rights, while providing safe passage for those who preferred emigration to life under Christian rule. These generous terms reflected both the Catholic monarchs' desire to avoid the costs of a destructive assault and their understanding that effective governance would require the cooperation of Granada's substantial population. The symbolic ceremony of January 2nd, 1492, when Boabdil formally surrendered the keys of Granada to Isabella and Ferdinand, marked the completion of a process that had begun with Pelayo's victory at Covadonga 7 centuries earlier. The banner of Castile and the cross of Santiago, flying over the Alhambra, signaled the end of Islamic political authority in Iberia, while beginning a new chapter in the long history of cultural interaction between Christian and Islamic civilizations. Yet the completion of territorial recovery also marked the beginning of new challenges that would test the institutional frameworks developed during centuries of conquest and consolidation. The sudden incorporation of Granada's population into the Christian realms raised questions about religious tolerance, cultural accommodation, and political loyalty that would influence Spanish policy for generations to come. The resources freed by the end of domestic warfare would soon be redirected toward imperial ventures that would transform Spain into a global power while creating new forms of diversity and complexity within Iberian society. The year 1492 thus represented both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of the longest military campaign in European history, and the commencement of imperial expansion that would carry Spanish influence to every continent on Earth. The techniques of conquest, colonization, and cultural integration developed during the Reconquista would provide templates for governing diverse populations throughout the 15th century Americas, while the sense of divine mission that had sustained Christian resistance for 8 centuries would justify expansion into territories that the medieval mind could barely imagine. The banner of Castile flying over the Alhambra on that January morning in 1492 marked not merely the end of a war, but the completion of one of history's most extraordinary transformations. 800 years earlier, a handful of refugees had huddled in mountain caves, their world shattered by foreign invasion, their future uncertain beyond the next winter's survival. Now their descendants ruled an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to Gibraltar, commanding resources that would soon carry Castilian authority to every corner of the known world. Yet victory brought challenges that battlefield triumph could never resolve. The generous terms granted to the vanquished inhabitants of the last emirate reflected both magnanimity and practical necessity. Isabella and Ferdinand possessed neither the desire nor the capability to govern through force alone a territory whose residents outnumbered their own subjects. The Treaty of 1491 had promised protection for Arab customs, devotional practices, and legal codes, creating a framework for coexistence that would be tested by the realities of governing a diverse realm. The initial years following surrender witnessed a remarkable experiment in accommodation. The first archbishop of the conquered city, Hernando de Talavera, implemented policies that recognized the complexity of ruling communities whose loyalties had been shaped by generations of separate development. Arab law continued to govern personal matters affecting the local populace, while established crafts and agricultural practices received protection from authorities who understood their economic value. The magnificent palace complex of the former rulers became a residence rather than a target for destruction, symbolizing the conqueror's appreciation for the architectural achievements of their predecessors. This tolerant approach, however, proved increasingly difficult to maintain, as the euphoria of victory gave way to the practical challenges of integration. The arrival of settlers from northern regions, many carrying convictions hardened by generations of warfare, created tensions with existing communities who had expected to maintain their ways of life. Incidents of friction multiplied as different groups competed for economic opportunities and social status within the new order. The appointment of Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros as Talavera's successor marked a fundamental shift toward policies that prioritized conformity over social harmony. This austere Franciscan, whose personal piety was matched only by his political ruthlessness, viewed the diversity that had characterized Iberian life as an obstacle to the creation of a truly unified realm. Under his guidance, the promises of toleration that had secured peaceful surrender began to erode through administrative pressure and legal restrictions. The forced conversions that began in 1499 represented the abandonment of the accommodation policies that had initially governed the integration of conquered lands. Arab manuscripts were burned in public ceremonies, designed to demonstrate the completeness of the transformation. Ancient dress, customs, and even architectural features that reflected Moorish heritage faced systematic suppression. The Mudéjar communities that had maintained their identity under generations of coexistence found themselves confronting demands for conversion that left no middle ground between apostasy and exile. The establishment of the Inquisition in 1478 had initially focused on ensuring the orthodoxy of Jewish converts to Christianity, but its mandate gradually expanded to encompass all forms of doctrinal dissent. The tribunal's procedures, borrowed from earlier ecclesiastical institutions, but implemented with unprecedented bureaucratic efficiency, created a climate of suspicion that affected every level of life. The concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, developed as a mechanism for distinguishing between old Christians, whose ancestry predated the Arab conquest, and new Christians whose conversion might mask continued adherence to forbidden practices. The expulsion of the Jewish community in 1492, occurring within months of the completion of territorial recovery, demonstrated the monarch's commitment to creating a homogeneous realm regardless of economic consequences. The departure of perhaps 150,000 individuals, including financiers, craftsmen, physicians, and scholars, whose skills had contributed to Iberian prosperity for generations, reflected a willingness to sacrifice immediate material interests for the sake of ideological consistency. The Morisco community that resulted from the forced conversion of Arab inhabitants represented a particularly complex challenge for authorities, committed to both political unity and doctrinal orthodoxy. These nominally converted groups retained practices, linguistic heritage, and social networks that reflected their Moorish background while officially embracing Christianity. The suspicion that their conversion was superficial created ongoing tensions that would plague the realm for over a century. The revolt of the Alpujarras in 1568 to 1571 revealed the ultimate failure of forced assimilation policies. The mountain communities that rose in opposition to Philip II's attempts to suppress Arab practices demonstrated that surface conversion had not eliminated deeper loyalties forged by generations of separate development. The brutal suppression of this rebellion, followed by the systematic deportation of Morisco groups from their ancestral lands, marked the final abandonment of the pluralistic approaches that had once characterized Iberian life. The legacy of 800 years of coexistence proved more difficult to eliminate than the political and ecclesiastical institutions that had sustained it. The Castilian language itself bore permanent traces of its Arab era, with thousands of Arabic words integrated so thoroughly into daily vocabulary that their foreign origin became invisible to later speakers. Architectural styles developed over the long period continued to shape building patterns throughout the early modern era, creating a distinctive aesthetic that combined geometric motifs with Christian symbolic content. The agricultural and artisanal techniques that had sustained prosperity throughout the Moorish era survived the political transformation through practical necessity. The sophisticated irrigation systems that had made Andalusian agriculture the envy of Europe required maintenance by individuals who understood their operation, while the craft techniques that had produced Toledo steel, Cordoba leather, and Valencia silk demanded skills that could not be immediately replaced by northern colonists. The intellectual heritage of Arab Iberia found refuge in translation projects that transmitted crucial texts to Renaissance European scholars. The works of Averroes, Avicenna, and other philosophers had already shaped scholasticism through the translation schools of Toledo, but the dispersal of manuscript collections following the fall created new opportunities for European intellectuals to engage with Arab scholarly works. The mathematical innovations, astronomical observations, and medical knowledge preserved in these texts would contribute to the scientific revolution that transformed European civilization. Meanwhile, the completion of territorial unification freed resources and energy for projects that would transform the peninsula into Europe's first global empire. The same year that witnessed the fall of the last emirate also saw Columbus's departure for the Indies, beginning a process of expansion that would carry conquistadors to Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines. The techniques of warfare, colonization, and administration developed over 800 years of Iberian conflict would provide templates for governing diverse peoples throughout the Americas. The conquistadors who would topple the Aztec and Inca empires carried with them not only weapons and diseases, but also institutional frameworks refined through generations of frontier warfare. The encomienda system that governed labor relations in the New World reflected the feudal arrangements that had developed over the Reconquest era, while the legal codes applied to indigenous peoples drew upon precedents established for ruling Arab subjects. The missions that sought to convert Native American communities employed strategies developed through the forced Christianization of Moorish inhabitants. The wealth that flowed into the peninsula from American colonies transformed it from a collection of relatively poor kingdoms into the dominant power in 16th century Europe. The silver mines of Potosi and the gold of Mexico provided resources on a scale that dwarfed anything available to other European monarchs, enabling Philip II to pursue imperial policies that spanned from the Netherlands to the Philippines. Yet this very success created new forms of diversity within the realm as colonial administrators, merchants, and clergy brought American influences back to the peninsula. The marriage of the Reconquest legacy with imperial expansion created a distinctive form of Castilian identity that would shape the peninsula's development for generations. The sense of divine mission that had sustained Christian resistance through the darkest periods of Arab dominance found new expression in the global spread of Catholic Christianity. The warrior ethos that had characterized frontier nobility adapted to the challenges of conquering and governing vast overseas territories. The legal frameworks that had developed from governing diverse Iberian peoples provided structures for administering colonial realms that included Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans. The black legend that arose from Protestant criticism of imperial policies drew much of its force from the contradiction between the ideals that had supposedly motivated the Reconquest and the realities of colonial exploitation. Critics argued that the same fervor that had justified warfare on Islamic rulers had been perverted into a tool for oppressing indigenous peoples whose only crime was adherence to different spiritual beliefs. The Inquisition that had been established to ensure orthodoxy within the peninsula became a symbol of fanaticism and cruelty when its methods were applied to colonial realms. Yet the complexity of colonial life defied simple moral categorization. The legal protections extended to indigenous peoples, though often honored in the breach, reflected genuine attempts to apply Christian ethical principles to unprecedented situations. The universities established in Mexico City and Lima provided educational opportunities that exceeded those available in most European cities, while the artistic and architectural achievements of colonial communities created new forms of synthesis that borrowed elements from European, Arab, and indigenous heritage. The decline of imperial power over the 17th and 18th eras coincided with renewed appreciation for the achievements of the Moorish era. Romantic writers and artists rediscovered the architectural splendors of the Alhambra, the philosophical sophistication of Averroes, and the poetic forms that had flourished in Córdoba and Seville. This nostalgia for a lost golden age of synthesis contrasted sharply with the intolerance that had characterized the early modern era, creating new forms of identity that incorporated rather than rejected Arab heritage. The rise of modern nationalism over the 19th century required a fundamental re-examination of the Reconquest legacy. Liberal intellectuals argued that the struggle had been motivated by desires for political freedom rather than doctrinal orthodoxy, while conservative thinkers emphasized the role of Catholic Christianity in preserving European civilization from Eastern expansion. These competing interpretations reflected broader debates about the relationship between Catholic identity and modern democratic values that would continue to shape politics well into the 20th century. The Civil War of 1936 to 1939 witnessed the revival of Reconquest imagery by both sides of the conflict. Francisco Franco's nationalist movement explicitly compared its struggle to the warfare of the past, while Republican forces argued that they were fighting to complete the liberation begun by the rebels of old. The victory of Franco's forces led to the official adoption of a historical narrative that portrayed the Reconquest as the foundation of greatness, while minimizing the contributions of Arab civilization. The democratic transition that followed Franco's death in 1975 created opportunities for more nuanced examinations of history that acknowledged both the achievements and the costs of the conquest. Archaeological excavations revealed the sophistication of Arab urban civilization, while scholarly research demonstrated the extent to which modern culture had been shaped by Moorish elements. The restoration of Arab monuments became a source of national pride, rather than embarrassment, symbolizing evolution toward a more inclusive understanding of historical identity. The modern state that developed from this process of historical reconciliation bears little resemblance to the homogeneous realm that Isabella and Ferdinand had sought to create. The autonomous communities that govern Catalonia, the Basque country, and Andalusia reflect recognition that identity encompasses multiple linguistic, ethnic, and historical elements that cannot be reduced to a single narrative. The Arab heritage that had been suppressed over the early modern era now receives official recognition as an integral part of the peninsula's patrimony. The contemporary significance of the Reconquest extends far beyond the peninsula's borders, shaping debates about immigration, multiculturalism, and tolerance throughout Europe and the Americas. The methods of integration developed over the long struggle provide both positive and negative examples for modern states struggling to balance diversity with unity. The legal frameworks that developed from governing mixed communities offer precedents for contemporary efforts to protect minority rights while maintaining social cohesion. The global reach of the Reconquest legacy reflects its role in shaping the first European colonial empire and the institutions that governed it. The languages, legal systems, and practices that colonization carried throughout the Americas bear permanent traces of the encounter between Christian and Arab civilizations. The modern nations that developed from the empire, from Mexico to Argentina, from the Philippines to parts of the United States, continue to grapple with questions of identity and tolerance that first arose over 800 years of Iberian struggle. As we survey this vast historical landscape from the perspective of the 21st century, the Reconquest appears not as a simple story of triumph, but as a complex drama of encounter, adaptation, and transformation. The Christian warriors who began their struggle in the mountains of Asturias could never have imagined that their descendants would rule territories spanning the globe, nor could they have anticipated that their greatest achievements would involve not the elimination of Arab heritage, but its creative synthesis with European elements. The true legacy of the Reconquest lies not in the victories that restored Christian political control, but in the innovations that developed from 800 years of coexistence, conflict, and accommodation. The realm that completed its territorial recovery in 1492 was profoundly different from the Visigothic kingdom that had fallen to Arab forces in 711, richer, more sophisticated, and paradoxically more diverse, despite the homogenizing pressures of orthodoxy. The world that expansion would create in the following centuries would bear the permanent imprint of this encounter between civilizations, ensuring that the story of the Reconquest would continue to shape human development long after its final battle had been fought and its last treaty signed.